Have African nations become developed? Not yet, but the goal is not too far now. Mali, a nation always labeled as poor by the West, has made plans that will make the West beg Mali for partnership. Instead of waiting for anyone to come and help Mali with lithium mining, agricultural capabilities, and urbanization, Mali has decided to do it all. It is working on projects that will fulfill the market's demand. This brings Mali very close to the label of being developed.
On December 15, 2024, Mali inaugurated the largest lithium mine in Africa, the fifth largest globally, known as Lithium Mali SA, located in Goulamina, Bougouni region. This landmark project is not only a milestone for Mali, but positions the nation as a critical player in the global energy market, particularly as the world pivots toward clean energy solutions. The inauguration ceremony.
IMF, World Bank, all other institutions, they make African countries jump through hoops. Loans will never be able to pay. The US, when they borrow money, they're getting it in 1.5, 1.9 interest rate. Africans, when they get the same amount of money, they're paying 9, 10%. The people who don't need a break, they get a break. The ones who need a break, they don't get a break. The sheer survival of the World Bank, IMF, is based on the fact that African countries and many other developing countries do not succeed. Their success is based on our failure. That has to change. And guess who can make that change? We, the children of Africa.
Is the West more dependent on Africa than we thought? As African nations impose export bans on Western countries, it's becoming clear who needs whom. The West is feeling the pinch. What's the strategy now, and which countries have led this movement? Let's find out. For decades, Western economies have thrived on the assumption that Africa will continue supplying cheap raw materials to fuel their industries. Oil, gold, uranium, lithium, and other resources.
On the eve of the 113th birthday of Africa's oldest liberation movement, the ANC president Cyril Ramaphosa is advocating for the processing of South Africa's mineral resources in the country and the export of finished products rather than raw materials. When we mine our minerals, we must at least beneficiate many of them here and export the finished products so that other countries buy products made in South Africa.
The announcement came quietly at first, just a short broadcast from a press room in Lusaka, delivered without fanfare. Yet within minutes, it spread across the world like wildfire. Africa, home to more than half of the planet's known lithium reserves, had issued a continent-wide ban on the export of unprocessed lithium, no raw or wood. Leave African soil again. All foreign contracts were frozen. All mining concessions were up for review. Refining and battery production would happen only on African land under African ownership. The global market reacted instantly and violently. Lithium, the mineral that powered electric vehicles, smartphones, satellites, renewable grids, and almost every battery storing energy worldwide, was suddenly locked behind a wall of sovereignty. Countries that had built entire green energy roadmaps around African minerals were now scrambling. Factories halted production. Governments held emergency meetings. Investors panicked. The shockwave was not just economic, it was existential. For decades, the world had treated Africa as a warehouse of raw materials. Lithium from Zimbabwe, Namibia, Mali, and the Democratic Republic of Congo had been shipped out as cheap or refined abroad and sold back at enormous markups. Europe, Asia, and North America had become dependent on this flow, assuming it would never be interrupted. But Africa had changed. A new wave of leaders, scientists, industrialists, and youth movements had reshaped public consciousness. They were tired of watching their resources leave in bulk and return as expensive finished products. They were tired of mines that scarred the land while contributing little to national development. They were tired of promises from foreign investors that never translated into real progress. The lithium ban was not just a policy, it was a declaration. Across Johannesburg, Nairobi, Kigali, and Accra, crowds gathered in the streets celebrating. News channels replayed the announcement over and over. Analysts called it the most decisive economic move the continent had ever made. Ministers framed it as the beginning of a new industrial era. Students marched carrying signs calling for Africa to become the world's next clean energy superpower. But thousands of kilometers away, in Washington, Brussels, Tokyo, and Beijing, the reactions were very different. In Europe, electric vehicle manufacturers went into immediate crisis mode. Assembly lines in Germany and France depended heavily on African lithium. Without it, the ambitious transition plans to phase out fossil fuel vehicles were at risk. Automotive CEOs warned of delays, shortages, and potential collapse. Politicians demanded urgent negotiations. Citizens, already weary of rising energy prices, worried about the future. In the United States, clean tech companies scrambled for alternatives, only to discover that the global lithium supply outside Africa was nowhere near enough. Prices doubled, then tripled. Small battery companies declared bankruptcy. Stock markets shook. Political commentators began calling the ban the greatest supply chain shock of the 21st century. In China, the reaction was even more dramatic. China's entire EV empire, its batteries, factories, and global exports had been built on African minerals. Suddenly, every major battery manufacturer in Shenzhen, Shanghai, and Guangzhou faced uncertainty. Within hours, Chinese delegations flew to African capitals, trying to salvage deals. But Africa, united as never before, responded with a single voice. We are not refusing to sell lithium. We are refusing to sell it cheap and unprocessed. If you want it, build factories here. Those words reverberated across the global economy like thunder. Africa had flipped the script, and the world had no choice but to listen. In Harare, where some of the world's richest lithium fields lay, local leaders unveiled plans for Africa's first continent-wide battery manufacturing zone. Large tracts of industrial land were set aside for gigafactories. Renewable-powered refining plants were approved. Engineers from Ghana, Kenya, and Egypt convened to design new processing systems. Boards of investors from South America, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East arrived, eager to participate in the African industrial boom. The air felt electric with possibility. For the first time in its post-colonial history, Africa was leveraging its natural wealth from a position of strength. But the ban created chaos in the outside world. In Europe, the disruption reached every sector. Without lithium, the continent's renewable energy storage plans stalled. Wind and solar installations slowed down because there was no way to store surplus energy. Governments faced public outrage as electricity prices surged. Protests erupted demanding immediate action. Leaders held summits that lasted through the night, discussing how to secure alternative supplies. But the truth was unavoidable. There were no alternatives on Earth large enough to replace Africa's reserves. The world had underestimated Africa, and now it was paying the price. Meanwhile, Africa was transforming at incredible speed. Roads around mining regions were modernized. Freight rail systems expanded. Universities launched new programs in materials science and chemical engineering. Technical institutes trained tens of thousands of young Africans to work in battery plants. Cities that once relied on raw mineral exports were now bustling with new industries. What shocked the world most was not just Africa's unity, but its precision. The ban was part of a much bigger strategy, one planned quietly for years. African nations had been studying how Southeast Asia built its electronics empire, how Latin America protected its agricultural markets, and how Middle Eastern states used oil revenues to build sovereign wealth funds. Now Africa was applying those lessons to the mineral of the future. Within months, the first African lithium refinery opened in Namibia. The second followed in Zambia. A third broke ground in Mozambique. Congolese technicians trained in South Korea returned home to work in advanced processing labs. Tanzanian engineers unveiled experimental battery prototypes designed specifically for hot climates. Suddenly, Africa was not just a supplier. It was a contender. The shift unsettled global powers. In the United States, congressional hearings accused African governments of triggering an international crisis. Lobbyists pressured lawmakers to retaliate, but economists explained that there was no retaliation strong enough to reverse the ban. Without African lithium, the United States would fall behind in the global race for clean energy. The only viable option was cooperation. In Japan and South Korea, tech companies saw opportunity where others saw disaster. They began negotiating long-term partnerships with African governments, offering to build factories, research labs, and training programs directly on the continent. This approach resonated with Africa's new industrial vision, but Europe struggled the most. For decades, Europe had seen Africa as a region it must guide and support. Now the dynamic had reversed. African leaders spoke with confidence in diplomatic meetings. They insisted on equal partnerships, technology transfer, fair pricing, and shared ownership. European delegations found themselves negotiating from a weaker position than ever before. The global media began calling the lithium ban Africa's economic revolution. But within Africa, leaders saw it not as revolution but restoration. In many capitals, officials reminded citizens that the continent had been stripped of minerals for centuries. Gold, diamonds, copper, manganese, uranium resources that enriched the world but left African economies vulnerable. The lithium ban was a correction to a historical imbalance, not an act of hostility. But although Africa celebrated, the path ahead was not simple. Building industries required money, technology, expertise, and time. Mining companies from Europe and North America tried to undermine the new system by predicting failure, hoping to pressure Africa into reversing the ban. But Africa remained firm, and then something unexpected happened. A small, solar-powered processing plant in Botswana succeeded in producing the continent's first fully refined, battery-ready lithium carbonate 100% African. The achievement sent a surge of pride through the continent. It proved that Africa did not need to export or to survive. It could refine, manufacture, innovate, and lead. The breakthrough inspired other nations. Kenya accelerated plans for a new research university focused on battery chemistry. Nigeria announced a sovereign wealth fund dedicated to clean energy infrastructure. Ethiopia proposed an African battery alliance to coordinate production across regions. Morocco expanded its already booming renewable industry, offering to integrate African-made batteries into its solar megaprojects. The continent was becoming a global laboratory of clean energy innovation. Meanwhile, global corporations once dominant found themselves shut out. Many tried to pressure African governments through diplomatic back channels, but the unity among African states was unprecedented. Any attempt to undermine one country triggered support from others. The continent had finally discovered the strength of collective bargaining. The economic shock continued to ripple through the world. Battery prices soared. EV manufacturers in Europe and North America postponed new models. Green energy companies delayed major projects. Even space agencies felt the impact as lithium-based power systems became harder to source. Yet Africa thrived. Unemployment rates fell as energy plants, refineries, and transport hubs created millions of jobs. Skilled workers once forced to migrate now returned home. Foreign students came to Africa to study mineral engineering. Cities grew, not from extraction and collapse, but from industry and innovation. The ban also changed African geopolitics. Countries that once competed for foreign investment now collaborated, sharing data, research, and infrastructure. The African Continental Free Trade Area became the backbone of the new mineral economy. By processing lithium locally, nations earned 5 to 10 times more revenue than raw exports ever provided. For the first time in modern history, Africa was shaping global markets instead of reacting to them. But the defining moment came 2 years after the ban, when Africa unveiled its first fully African-made electric vehicle at an energy summit in Kigali. The car, powered by African lithium batteries, symbolized the continent's transformation from a supplier of raw materials to a pioneer of innovation. Global industries were forced to recognize a new reality. Africa was no longer a passive participant in the world economy, it was a driver of it. The shockwaves had settled, but the global landscape was forever changed. Africa had claimed its place, not through war, coercion, or concession, but through the power of its own mineral wealth. Its unity, and its decision to value itself. The lithium ban had not just reshaped global industry, it had rewritten global history. The shockwaves rippling through the world did not weaken as the months dragged on. Instead, they intensified, spreading into places that had once believed themselves insulated from Africa's decisions. The lithium ban had become more than a trade disruption. It had become a mirror, forcing nations to confront what they had ignored for generations. Africa's centrality to the world's technological future. In Brussels, arguments broke out daily between member states. Some wanted to pressure Africa through diplomatic channels. Others, especially those with large tech and automotive industries, had begun advocating for something radical partnership on Africa's terms, but agreeing on what that meant proved impossible. European governments were discovering that negotiating with Africa required humility, a trait they were not accustomed to performing on the world stage. Asia was no different. South Korea's battery manufacturers, among the biggest in the world, scrambled to diversify their supply lines. The Philippines attempted to accelerate its own lithium extraction, but environmental protests stalled every effort. Indonesia proposed a regional alliance to counterbalance Africa's leverage, but the scale was still too small to compete. The truth was unavoidable. Africa controlled more than half of the world's unearthed lithium reserves. And its new policies meant that no nation could bypass the continent without accepting that the rules had changed. Within Africa itself, the transformation had become visible. Countries that once fought for small margins of revenue were now collaborating with surprising fluidity. The African Union had established a new commission based in Addis Ababa, tasked solely with managing mineral policy across member states. Delegates from Zambia, Zimbabwe, Namibia, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Tanzania met weekly, not simply to coordinate production but to protect the sovereignty of the continent's industrialization. The agreements they forged were unprecedented. Instead of competing for foreign contracts, they pooled resources, standardized taxation, and created a unified framework that forced foreign companies to negotiate with Africa as a single bloc. For the first time in history, the narrative had flipped. Rather than Africa waiting at the door of global markets, the world now waited outside the gates of Africa's choosing. In the cities of the continent, this shift was more than political, it was emotional. Generations raised on stories of exploitation watched with astonishment as global leaders flocked to Africa not to dictate but to request. The change created a sense of pride that no policy could quantify. Street vendors in Nairobi discussed lithium prices with the same enthusiasm that football once commanded. Students in Dar es Salaam debated Africa's energy future with a clarity that startled visiting analysts. The movement wasn't merely economic, it was cultural, it was psychological. It was historical correction unfolding in real time. By the 8th month of the ban, the global economy had begun showing cracks that no amount of diplomacy could conceal. Electric vehicle manufacturers had slowed production to a crawl. Battery factories in North America paused construction. European renewable energy firms delayed solar grid storage projects because lithium-based systems could no longer be guaranteed. Even the aerospace industry felt the sting, as several planned satellite launches were postponed due to material shortages. Governments issued statements that attempted to mask desperation behind professional neutrality, but the markets were not fooled. Investors had grown restless. Countries that relied heavily on technology exports, especially Germany and Japan, faced pressure from their manufacturing sectors. Stock markets fluctuated violently, reacting to every tiny rumor of a negotiation with African leaders, and yet Africa remained consistent. No amount of pressure shifted the continent's stance. The ban would remain until new agreements were signed, agreements that ensured Africa's autonomy, secured domestic processing, and guaranteed that value creation happened within the continent rather than being siphoned away. The breakthrough did not come from the United States or Europe. It came from a coalition of smaller nations. Sweden, Finland, Belgium, and Austria. Their representatives traveled to Lusaka with an unexpected message, not demands, but acknowledgement. They admitted openly that the world had taken Africa for granted. They proposed a partnership that treated African processors as equal shareholders with veto power. They offered joint training programs, scholarships, and technology transfer packages that had no hidden clauses. Their sincerity surprised the African delegation, and in return, Africa proposed a pilot partnership, a small one, limited to a portion of Zambia and Zimbabwe's processing capacity, but one that could demonstrate how the new future might look. The announcement sent global markets into a frenzy. Not because the deal itself was enormous, but because it signaled that Africa might finally begin reopening the door. But the continent made something else clear. The ban itself would remain until every negotiation with every major foreign partner aligned with the same principles. The pressure on major powers intensified further. The United States, facing shortages in both civilian and military technology sectors, convened emergency meetings to reassess its Africa strategy. For years, the nation had relied on its own scientific innovation to overshadow its lack of mineral resources. Now, without lithium, even the most advanced laboratories could not produce functional batteries. China, which had invested heavily in Africa for 2 decades, found itself in a difficult position. Its companies had built many of the roads, power plants, and processing facilities now being utilized by Africa's emerging industries. And, while China held long-standing agreements with several African states, those agreements were not exempt from the ban. The new policy required renegotiation, and the African Union insisted that the old era of lopsided deals was over. Chinese negotiators tried to maintain a strong posture, but even they understood the stakes. China's own electric vehicle giants were slowing production. Domestic criticism grew louder, and so China approached the African Union with something that surprised even its critics: openness to a multipolar partnership instead of seeking exclusive access. It offered technology exchange, joint research centers, and renewable energy installations that would remain under African ownership. It was the first time all major powers, China, the United States, and the European bloc, found themselves negotiating from the same level. Not because they wanted to, but because Africa had forced it. Within Africa, factories that had once been quiet were now humming with life. In Harare, a battery prototype lab had begun producing sample packs for electric buses, developed entirely by African engineers. In Kinshasa, students at a university designed a lithium-based storage system for rural electrification, earning international attention. In Windhoek, a processing facility that had been dormant for decades reopened with new robotic systems supplied by South Korea but operated by local technicians. The world watched as the continent's industrial capabilities expanded at a pace no one had anticipated. What foreign analysts had underestimated was the depth of Africa's ambition. Once the ban decentralized the old power structures, dormant potential accelerated into visible action. A new generation of African economists argued that the ban was not merely an economic decision. It was a declaration of identity, a refusal to let the continent's future mirror its past. They believed that Africa could achieve technological sovereignty, not in some distant future, but within the next 2 decades. And for the first time, this vision seemed not only possible but inevitable. As the second year approached, pressure reached its highest point. Nations whose industries relied heavily on lithium-based technology pleaded for stable agreements. Renewable energy targets around the world were at risk. Electric public transport systems stalled. Consumer markets faced shortages. It became clear that the global economy could not stabilize without a new equilibrium, one that treated Africa not as a resource bit but as a strategic partner. The old model had collapsed. A new one was needed. African leaders convened in Kigali for a decisive summit. Delegates from over 30 nations filled the hall, each aware that the world waited for their decision. The debate was long, passionate, and complex. Some feared that lifting the ban too soon would weaken Africa's leverage. Others argued that global stability was necessary for Africa's own growth. But the majority agreed that Africa must transition from a position of defensive strength to one of constructive leadership. The final declaration surprised the world. Africa would partially lift the ban, but only for nations that had signed the new Joint Industrialization Accords. It was a selective reopening, a strategic alignment that ensured the continent retained its bargaining power while allowing the global economy to recover. When the announcement was broadcast worldwide, relief washed across global markets. Stock prices stabilized, manufacturers recalibrated their timelines. But beneath the relief was a new awareness. Africa had changed the rules permanently. The global economy had been reshaped, and the world had little choice but to adapt. In the months that followed, the consequences of Africa's stance became visible everywhere. In Europe, battery factories now operated in direct partnership with African processors, sharing profits instead of extracting them. In the United States, new supply agreements included clauses guaranteeing that a percentage of all processing would occur on African soil. In China, joint research centers staffed by African and Chinese experts developed innovative battery technologies that belonged jointly to both sides. The world was learning cooperation not through goodwill but through necessity. The greatest transformation, however, took place within Africa itself. Infrastructure projects accelerated. Technical universities expanded. Youth employment surged. Private African companies, once overshadowed by foreign corporations, emerged as competitive global players. The ban had forced resilience, but it had also unleashed creativity and confidence that had long been suppressed. More importantly, Africans everywhere felt something unfamiliar yet deeply powerful: ownership over the continent's destiny. By the end of the decade, analysts agreed that the lithium ban would be remembered not as a disruption, but as a turning point, a moment when Africa rewrote its role in the global economy, shifting from exploited periphery to sovereign powerhouse. What began as shockwaves had ended as a continental awakening. And in the quiet, reflective corners of the world, observers admitted a truth that had been ignored for generations. The future of global technology had never belonged solely to the industrial giants of the West or East. It had always belonged to Africa, waiting for the moment it chose to claim it.